The broadcast is now starting.
So first off, what has changed? There are new tropical storm warnings for the coastline, and the hurricane watches have also been retained, and we still have storm surge watches in effect for the Gulf Coast and the bays. So here's a look at the latest forecast track. You see it looks fairly similar to what we saw yesterday. Beta has started to make that western turn, right now analyzed with a movement toward the northwest at just 3 miles per hour. The intensity is the same as we briefed last night. It has not intensified. In fact, the storm has been fighting some vertical wind shear and some dry air, so that's kind of kept it at its current intensity. Hurricane Center does still think there's the potential for it to intensify to a hurricane before landfall, perhaps down near Matagorda Bay, but really could be anywhere on the lower, mid, and upper Texas coast. There's still a lot of uncertainty in that track, more likely the lower to mid Texas coast. And then at that point, it's most likely going to drift slowly up the coast. Here's the latest satellite picture. As I said, the Hurricane Center noted that the system is highly sheared, meaning most of the thunderstorm activity is sheared off to the northeast with an exposed low-level circulation. But notice in this very recent satellite image, there are thunderstorms. There are thunderstorms that are developing near the center of circulation. So it still is possible that the storm could get its act together, but up in the recent hours, it really has struggled to develop. And there is a fairly large wind field with this storm, especially on the northeast and northwest flank. So anytime you have a large tropical system, you have the potential to push a lot of water onto the coast, and that's what we're seeing with this storm. Another way to look at the time evolution, these are maps from the Weather Prediction Center, and you can see the tropical storm symbol there, starting in the central Gulf this morning, and then just kind of drifting slowly toward the coast. As it gets closer to the Texas coast, of course, the winds increase, and the rain shield will overspread the coastal areas. And then if you look in the bottom row there, you can see that slow track of the system up the Texas coast into Louisiana. So there is still a lot of uncertainty in exactly how this is going to play out, but this gives you an idea of the general sequence of events. The maps here on the right-hand side show the wind forecast over the Gulf. The left-hand column there is this evening, and the right-hand column is Sunday evening. And you could see in the orange there a fairly large swath of tropical storm force winds by this evening just off the coast. And so we've got a very large fetch there, very long stretch there of higher winds parallel to the coast, and this is a setup for pushing water onto the shoreline and coastal flooding. So this is why I'll show you the tide predictions in a moment. We are expecting some moderate coastal flooding as early as tonight and tomorrow. And then on the right-hand side, you can see those higher winds getting even closer, with perhaps tomorrow evening some tropical storm force winds already at our shoreline. The lower row there are the sea heights, significant wave heights this evening and tomorrow evening. And you can see in red there a fairly large area of 20-foot and higher seas offshore, and a lot of that wave energy will also be working its way toward the coast. So expect elevated tides and high surf at the coastline, along with increasing winds as we go through the day tomorrow and certainly into early next week. As far as the timing of the winds, we've been looking at this all week. You can see the arrival of tropical storm force winds based on the time arcs on this map. Most likely a time of arrival sometime tomorrow evening. You can see an 8 p.m. Time arc there, touching the Texas and Louisiana coastlines. Tomorrow evening or early tomorrow night is when we might expect to see those tropical storm force winds hit at least the coastal areas, and then making its way, making the higher winds making their way further inland as we go through the night. What about the higher wind speed probabilities? This is the point probabilities of 58 mile per hour winds. And you can see the focus there is a little bit more down the coast, centered kind of in our Matagorda Bay area. So Jackson, Matagorda counties would have the highest chance of the higher end tropical storm force winds. But there are still some 30 to 40 point probabilities up the coast to Galveston. So if we do get a scenario where it does maintain its intensity right at the coastline and then come up the coast, you might expect to see these higher winds likewise overspread the Galveston Bay area and points up the coast. Let's look at the tide levels, the tide evolution. This is output from our extratropical storm surge model, which tends to work pretty well, assuming it's driven by fairly accurate winds. And what you see is in red, you see the observed tide levels. So they've been running kind of in the 3 to 4 foot level range for high tides. But notice the next high tide this evening considerably higher. So the one this morning around 3.5, but the one this evening up close to 5 for Galveston Bay entrance here. So that would imply some water on roadways even as early as late this afternoon and evening. And then the tide tomorrow morning up around 5.5 feet. And then those high tides staying up around 5.5 feet into Monday. Notice that decrease late in the period. I wouldn't bank on that. We think those tide levels are going to remain up there as long as we have a storm working up the coast from our southwest. You would not expect the tide levels to come down. So big changes happening even today, late today. In 5 to 5.5 feet is pretty moderate coastal flooding, fairly significant. So the chart in the upper right is relative to mean lower low water, which a lot of emergency managers are used to using. I'm also showing it relative to mean higher high water, which is more the National Weather Service standard. And on that scale, it's in that 3 to 4 foot category. Same type of plot for Freeport, same idea, looking at the next tide cycle this evening to be up in that 4.5 foot regime, and then by Monday morning closer to 5, maybe even a bit higher by Sunday evening. And like I said before, even though you see some decreases beyond Sunday evening, don't count on that. We would expect those high tide levels to be maintained as we go into the early part of the week. And then on the mean higher high water scale, right around that 3 to 3.5 foot above mean higher high water. There is a storm surge watch in effect for our whole coastline, and those are typically issued when we're looking at inundation 3 feet or greater above mean higher high water. Looking at the bay, these numbers are quite similar to yesterday, and again, still significant. High tide this morning, only about 3 feet, but by the time we get to Sunday morning at Eagle Point, this is on the western shore of Galveston Bay, we're looking at 4.5 feet and then up around 5 feet Monday morning. So definitely some moderate coastal flooding here, some water on roadways, low-lying roadways, and in low-lying areas for sure. Pier 21, just a little bit different part of the bay, closer to the ferry area, and on the north shore of the of Galveston Island there. And you can see the same idea. The next high tide this evening is considerably higher, above 4 feet, and then close to 5 feet starting on Sunday morning, and then maintaining those 5-foot levels as you go into Monday, and we think likely beyond that. Again, I would disregard that decrease as you go beyond Monday. From the Hurricane Center, this is kind of their big picture view. On the left-hand image, you can see a broad stretch of 2 to 4 feet above mean higher high water. Again, that's the units that are used in the Weather Service most consistently. And so you can see that fits in with what we just saw with the extratropical model. We're seeing values really 3 to 4 feet all across our coastal areas and up around the bay. And so that's certainly consistent with that, and that's why we have that storm surge watch out for our entire area. That would likely be upgraded to a storm surge warning, possibly today. So, we have relatively high confidence that we are going to see this moderate coastal flooding. Of course, there is a rainfall and flood threat as well. Anytime you have a slow-moving system moving up the coast, tropical system, you have to be concerned about that. What we're looking at here is the rainfall forecast progression from the Weather Prediction Center. And you can see today and tomorrow, the rain is mostly offshore. But by the time we get to Monday, we're starting to see some of the heavier rains getting onto the coastal areas. And then Tuesday and Wednesday spreading further inland and then up into Louisiana as well. The 7-day total is in the lower right. And that's a whole lot of rain. Those contours there offshore, 15 to 20 inches. And then in our coastal areas, the idea is potentially 10 to 15 inches. But, as we all know, there's a lot of uncertainty in that, especially given that our part of the rainfall forecast is still day 3 and beyond. It's going to be very dependent on track. I'll show kind of a close-up there of the 7-day forecast. As we've been talking about, if it were to track a bit more offshore, it might keep the rain more east of us, but the track a little bit more inland would spread some of that heavier rain further inland as well. So that is still something we have to pin down as far as amounts, but understand the potential is there for flooding from heavy rain. And another thing we typically show in flash flood scenarios is the excessive rain outlook, which is issued out 3 days. And you can see on Monday they've put the coastal areas in a marginal risk of exceeding flash flood guidance. And so I would expect, as we look at tomorrow and as we see the Tuesday and Wednesday outlooks appear, you'll see some higher threats than that as we get into that Tuesday, Wednesday time frame. But yeah, that heavy rain starting to come in on Monday. So just to sum up, minor to moderate coastal flooding is likely along the bays and the Gulf, really starting to this evening. Those elevated tides are expected to continue through the middle of the week. So, of course, the concern is that this will cut some people off. If they have flooded roadways with the tides not subsiding, you might get some folks that are stranded. Flooding of some roads in low-lying areas. Heavy rain and flash flooding may occur, but this part of the forecast still uncertain. Potential for a lot of rain with a slow-moving. Anytime you have a slow-moving tropical system, so that's going to be a big concern for us early next week. And the track in general still very uncertain, but the overall consensus is for that slow draw up the Texas coast. Gusty winds also expected, likely to tropical storm and possibly to hurricane force. How high those winds get will depend on the track and intensity, which are still uncertain. We did have a conference call with Hurricane Center about an hour ago. There was quite a bit of discussion on the intensity of this system. And I know there's been a lot of questions on previous calls about rapid intensification. Is that possible? At this point, Hurricane Center not thinking so. There are some mitigating factors, some dry air and wind shear. But as we all know, forecasting the intensity of these storms is very difficult. So